The GroundFox is here. Let's take a closer look. Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Now a few weeks ago you may remember I did an unboxing video of the Artful Dodgers GroundFox conversion that I received for my Element Enduro. Well, a few weeks later on I've now completed the conversion and I thought I'd give you an overview of what I've done. So starting from the top, the most visible thing obviously is the body shell. This is the Proline Cliffhanger body shell, which started its life on my Enduro when it was built as a builder's kit 2 as a normal truck. And you can see here we've got some previous holes in it from where it was mounted onto the builder's kit 2. But I've trimmed it down quite a lot now because on the Artful Dodgers conversion it can sit a lot lower. I'll mention I did have to do a couple of attempts at drilling the holes to make it fit nicely, but we've got over that one, so I'll just put that to one side. As an overview on the chassis, the main things that you're looking at here are new chassis rails and a new transmission in the centre and various other accessories such as new sliders on the side and lots of new offset mounts here to make sure that the chassis is the correct width apart. Obviously the new chassis gives you a lot more shock mounting positions. The new transmission is lower and has an angled skid plate here that you can see. Which overall will make the truck much more suited to technical crawling and which obviously with a much lower centre of gravity. So starting off at the front, we've got a few big changes compared to the original Element Enduro. The first and most obvious one of these is the servo on axle conversion. Now you can put this onto a standard Enduro. It's one of the options with the GroundFox conversion kit. There is also a version that allows you to retain the CMS, the chassis mounted servo. Because it's allowed in our rules, I've gone for the servo on axle conversion. It hopefully should give slightly better performance. It gets rid of some of the bump steer effect from the panhard rod, but it does mean that you need to convert to a 4-link suspension here, and I'll show you that in a moment. But the servo on axle mount is very sturdy. It's two, I believe, steel plates bolted together onto the top of the Element transmission housing, and it works very effectively. Good news is, I was a bit concerned about this, you don't actually need to replace the steering rod here. This is the standard one from the Element. All you need to do is find some shorter links. These links, the rod ends, come from a GMade truck that I also have, and they take about 5mm off at each side and they fit perfectly, and that means that you can get the correct geometry then for the servo on axle conversion. And the other thing that you need to do for the servo on axle, which is maybe a bit trickier to see, I think I'll flip the trip over so you can see that, is that we've now converted the front axle to a 4-link setup rather like the rear axle. As standard, it only has 3 links on an Enduro plus the panhard rod, so you have to find an extra link to go in the upper section here. The good news is that Associated do the 93mm link that you need here as an option in their factory team line, and they're not very expensive and they're quite easy to get hold of, so that was a fairly easy part of the conversion. In fact, overall I didn't need any extra parts for the conversion beyond those extra links and finding these shorter rod ends in my spares box, so it's a very complete conversion. Another thing that is added onto this truck, which is not standard in the conversion kit but is another Artful Dodgers part, is this steel front bumper, which is very substantial and very nicely made and has a small 3D printed insert in it for a winch. I'm not using a conventional winch, so I don't have that wired up. One thing to bear in mind with this bumper, at least for now, is that it's quite short, doesn't go far forward on the chassis, and I did find that was a problem when I mounted my Cliffhanger body in the first instance. I've actually had to remount the body about 10mm further back from the middle, as you can see here, so that it actually clears the bumper. It does fit just, but it does mean that the rear arches of the body are very close to the tyres, which is not the way that it was originally intended to do, but it does work, so the body can be made to fit. Another thing to mention on the front end is the steering plates. Now, Artful Dodgers do supply some alternative steering plates that go on the steering knuckles here, which are longer to give more clearance. Now, in my circumstances, I haven't found any problems with clearance on the standard plates. and in fact I find it a bit easier to get full lock using the standard plates rather than the longer Artful Dodgers ones. So I've actually stuck with the standard steering plates on mine. Artful Dodgers also supply some small clips designed to go onto the bottom of the shocks here underneath the shock cup. They'll slide in under there to give more clearance again. And again, for the way that I've got my truck set up, I didn't need that extra clearance, so I've left those little clips off, and that means that I get more downward travel on the suspension. As you can see, when it's at full lock like that, it does slightly rub on the shock absorber. It isn't a problem when it's actually running. You don't notice anything binding up, and I have actually bought myself a couple of slightly wider hexes. These are 6mm ones from the kit on there at the moment. I'm going to switch to some 8mm wide brass ones, and that should give me a little bit extra width and also a little bit extra clearance, so that it's going to make less of a rub on the shocks as it goes round corners. Looking at the centre of the truck now, this is another area where there's been quite a lot of changes. The most obvious one is what's called the Fox belly, which is the combination of a new skid plate and a new motor plate, and the motor mounting plate actually rotates the transmission so that everything seems a lot lower and flatter. If you remember, the normal Element has this transmission standing up, so the spur gear is quite high. This brings the whole thing down very low, and has a very attractive competition kind of look. It looks very trick, and so that's one of the key things on this conversion. If I just flip this upside down as well, you'll see that the skid is flat, whereas on the standard Element Enduro the skid is offset to dip down a little bit below the chassis rails. So again, that contributes to slightly better clearance. It is an angled skid, so the leading edge of the skid is a little bit lower than the trailing edge of the skid. In theory, that means that if you can get the front of the skid over an obstacle, it's more likely to want to slide over that obstacle then, rather than having to work to get over the rest of the skid. And again, these nice 3D printed sliders are included as well. They're not extras, they're in the box. And these are very well designed. They are very, very well shaped, so that they're exactly the same as the bottom edge of the chassis rail. Really well thought out, and they give just enough space for the battery and the other electronics that you may have added on as well. In my case, I've gone for a 3S 1000 milliamp battery here, which is a neat fit on the slider. This gives me around about 45 minutes to maybe an hour's runtime. For electronics, I've ported across the Hobbywing AXE system that I was using in the Donor Enduro. So this is the AXE R2 speed controller, and this is the 540L 2100 kV R2 motor. Something to bear in mind with this motor is that the 540L can is slightly too long to fit. It does depend a little bit on which position you use to mount this link. Because I've stuck to the standard suggested setting, the link does rub on the motor if you have it in the standard position. So what I've chosen to do is just raise up this motor mount by 2mm. I've put 2mm spaces, you may just be able to see them, between the skid plate and the motor mounting plate. And that means that the motor now clears the link here, so you don't get any friction. It's a small compromise in terms of centre of gravity, but I would rather do that at this stage than get the Dremel out and start grinding away bits at the back of the motor when I'm not sure what I might expose if I go through the end bell there. So that's what I've chosen to do with that. I suspect that the normal 540 motor that they do would fit perfectly. A brushed 540 motor I'm sure would fit perfectly. A 550 motor I suspect probably wouldn't. And the final thing I'll mention about my electronics, there's no additional waterproofing included with this conversion kit, so there's no receiver box. This is a Futaba receiver, and I've done the trick of, which is something I've used on racing cars in the past, of dipping the circuit board in a product called Corrosion X. Which has normally worked pretty well on the racing cars. We'll see how well this works for waterproofing on the Krawler. And now taking a look at the rear of the truck, not too much to report on here, pretty much a straight transfer across of the parts from the Donor Element Enduro. As you can see, there is a much steeper angle to the shocks here, and there are a lot of different mounting positions. I've got mine set up in the kit standard or the conversion standard mounting positions. The only change I did make on the front was to flip the body mountings around so they fit my body better, but I'm going with a standard geometry all round. I've got the softest element springs here, the greens on the back at the moment. I think they may be too soft. I might go to the whites, which are the next stage up. On the front I'm running the whites. But yes, again, no concerns really about the geometry on the rear end. It all lines up perfectly with the standard settings, and you can get the truck very low down indeed. Has lots, which is all part of the low centre of gravity philosophy, I suppose. I just thought I'd get my tape measure out so we can do a few measurements about how low this conversion actually goes. So with the truck suspension fully compressed like this, and the measure there, we'll eyeball it a bit. That looks to me like about 300 mils ground clearance at the lowest, at the leading edge of the skid. And then if we lift it up to where these tyres are just leaving with the standard geometry, again, your breakover is something around the region of 65 to 70 millimeters at the leading edge of the skid. And another measurement we can take is if we look at the overall height of the whole chassis from the bottom of the skid to the top of the shock tower. Again, we're looking at something like 80 to 85 millimeters total height of the chassis from the bottom of the skid to the top of the shock tower. And the last thing I'll measure is the distance of the centre of the motor from the bottom of the skid. It's angled, so it's a bit tricky to do, but I'll go with the angle. And we're looking at something like, well, it's about 32 millimeters on this truck, but bearing in mind I've put 2 millimeter spacers underneath my motor, it would probably be 30 millimeters on a standard conversion. If we put it on the corner weight scales as well, we can see that the total weight is 2,560 grams. Bearing in mind this is probably quite a lightweight conversion, and the Cliffhanger shell is also very lightweight. And the front to rear weight balance, we've got 56% of the weight on the front axle and 44% on the rear. Overall, I'm really pleased with the quality of the conversion, and I think Artful Dodgers should be very pleased with what they've done. It seems to be a very capable truck from the short running I've done with it so far, and I'm looking forward to getting out into more competitions here in the UK and seeing how it does through some gates. As ever, I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any questions or comments, please do leave them underneath. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching.